Trump gave his Thursday night address, a Democratic senator let slip what was really at stake.
The other thing that we blocked yesterday was the SAVE Act, right? Which was literally allow this administration to rig our democracy so that it would be hard for any Democrat in any state to win any election.
There you have Senator Elissa Slotkin, nominally from Michigan, but really channeling her CIA training, admitting that her party can't win if the U.S. adopts the kind of voter identification laws that most of the other civilized nations in the world use. That's why President Trump addressed the nation on Thursday to motivate passage of the Save America Act. Of course, that speech has set the hair on fire of the entire anti-Trump universe. But what almost no one noticed is that on the same day, both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury stood at a different podium and announced the other half of the story, the half that isn't about ballots at all. I'm Susan Kokinda. I've followed the imperial assault on our country from the strategic mountaintop to the election integrity trenches in Michigan, which is why I know what Donald Trump did on Thursday was masterful. If you want to follow how this unfolds, hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Here's what I'm covering today. First, the cover-up the president flushed into the open, and the two ways the enemies tried to bury it again on the same night. Second, how the Michigan case study makes the president's point. And third, the bombshells that Rubio and Bessent dropped and how that completes the picture. So let's start with President Trump.
No country can be great without fair and honest elections. You have to trust your country, because if there can be no trust, there can be no greatness. Unfortunately, the system we have today falls catastrophically short of that standard. Tonight, I'm announcing the immediate declassification and release of critical intelligence, revealing shocking vulnerabilities in our election infrastructure.
Now, the fire hose of details is going to dominate the news about China, 220 million voter files, hacked systems, non-citizens on the payroll, and other vulnerabilities. People with more time than I have are going to parse every page of the now declassified documents, and that's important. But don't get drowned in the details. That wasn't the president's main purpose anyway. The importance of what he did on Thursday was to drag the cover-up into the daylight. That's what he wants you to see, that officials inside our own intelligence agencies work to keep the China findings away from the president and away from you. One FBI official even boasted that she was running a, quote, shadow government, unquote, to keep the intelligence buried. Let that sink in. The shadow government hiding a threat to our electoral processes. And this isn't really Democrat or Republican. It's a permanent apparatus that serves the modern empire. Well, the next morning, Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullins put it bluntly.
There's no question the intelligence community from the FBI, CIA, and even other places within DHS, not underneath President Trump's leadership, but that was underneath the Biden administration, kept it from President Trump and the American people in Congress. Everybody that purposely misled the American people, abused their power and their authority, and decided not to continue doing their job will be held accountable.
Now, Mullins was talking about those past cover-ups, but you actually saw how this works in real time, because there's two ways to bury something. You can wave it off as nothing, or you can make sure nobody sees it. And on Thursday, they did both. Here's the first. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, said, "That was an embarrassing speech with no new info, just lies and rehashed conspiracies. It's incumbent on all of us not to treat that like real news. No new info." This is the same Mark Warner who spent years on the Russiagate case. When the accused foreign actor was Russia, Warner demanded investigations, hearings, intelligence briefings, years of media coverage, and capped it all off with a 5-volume report. When the alleged foreign actor is China, he says the president revealed essentially nothing. Nothing to see here, folks. But saying nothing to see here only works on the people who saw it. So here's the second way you bury a story. You decide they shouldn't see it. ABC, NBC, and CNN decided not to show the president's primetime address on foreign interference in American elections. Remember how that topic dominated the news cycle for the entirety of Trump's first term? Instead, ABC ran a game show, and NBC ran Tom Hanks narrating a nature documentary about alligators in a Gulf Coast swamp. Secretary Mullins again drilled down on the importance of this.
So ABC and NBC not carrying that, why? What are they trying to cover up? Why wouldn't they want to inform the American people? Why are they calling themselves a news outlet if they're not actually trying to put the news out there? The president wasn't trying to relitigate what happened in 2020, although he definitely could at this point. The president was giving facts. What we have exposed, what the Biden administration covered up, what the intelligence community held from the American people, Congress, and the executive branch, and we're putting it out there. And yet, two major networks didn't want to cover it. I think the question really should say why.
That's it right there. The president wasn't trying to relitigate what happened in 2020. He was exposing a cover-up of vulnerabilities to our electoral processes. And the self-appointed guardians of democracy decided a game show was more important. Well, you won't find game shows or nature documentaries on Promethean Action. What you will find is a battle-tested analysis of the fight our nation is waging to reclaim its economic and strategic sovereignty. That's a good reason for you to sign up for our free newsletter. The link is in the description. So back in the TDS-dominated universe, the drumbeat never stops. Unfounded claims, no evidence, and on and on. Well, the president did drop a very specific tidbit that gives the whole picture away. He isn't relitigating the election, he's setting a trap. Many were expecting him to drop big bombshells about Fulton County, Georgia. He pointed somewhere else, and when he started talking about Muskegon, Michigan, I sat up and took notice. I was active with the Michigan Fair Elections Group when the Muskegon story broke, and I sat on many conference calls as it developed. Here's what happened. In the fall of 2020, the city clerk in Muskegon started receiving thousands of new voter registrations when the city usually receives around 250. Over 8,000 new registrations were delivered by an outfit called GBI Strategies, a company contracted by major Democratic groups to the tune of millions of dollars in the 2020 election cycle. The clerk noticed identical handwriting on the signatures on many of the registrations and called the authorities. Investigators raided GBI's offices in Michigan, seized prepaid gift cards, company records, and 5 semi-automatic rifles with suppressors and 5 customized pistols. No one ever explained the artillery. But what happened to the investigation? It got handed over to the Biden FBI and buried. That's what the president wants you to see. Not proof that changes the outcome of 2020, but the methods that were used and then covered up. Well, Donald Trump is now putting the biggest spotlight in the world on this entire apparatus, and Secretary Mullins made clear that the full enforcement and prosecution powers of the U.S. government will now be deployed against it. Now, remember what Elissa Slotkin said at the outset? If you can't run elections the way the Democrats have been running them, we'll never win again? Well, that's the motive, stated out loud. Rigging the vote is the first lever. But when that won't do the job, the empire reaches for a second lever. And that is exactly why Rubio and Bessent were standing at that other podium on Thursday. So, a few hours before the president spoke on Thursday, the State Department convened what they called a ministerial on the resurgence of political terrorism. 60 nations were focused on the danger of left-wing terrorism. I'll get to Secretary Rubio's main speech in a moment, but to see where it all fits in, you need to hear what Scott Bessent said first.
And before I proceed, I'm going to go off script for a minute, which is always dangerous, but I'm going to remind everyone in this room and all the media that I was the subject of an assassination attempt February 2024 by an adult left-wing activist 2 hours after being sworn into my job. So any of you who want to report that this is a fiction and does not exist, be there for the sentencing this August.
This is the other half of the story. How does an imperial elite take over nations? Well, they can rig elections, but they can also do it by removing the people who will challenge their policies. People like Scott Bessent, people like Donald Trump. Keep that in mind as you listen to Secretary Rubio, who catalogs some of the previous victims of political left-wing terror.
You remember the machine gun massacres of Italy's Red Brigades, which held the 5-time prime minister captive for 55 days before subjecting him to a revolutionary so-called people's trial and executing him in 1978. You remember the Red Army faction's nearly 3-decade campaign of bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations in Germany, murdering dozens and injuring hundreds more.
Rubio didn't name the names, but I will. That Italian prime minister was Aldo Moro, the most powerful politician in Italy at the time, killed at the exact moment he was building a stable, self-governing Italy, when the whole imperial game depended on keeping Italy weak and divided. But it's the German assassinations that Rubio mentioned where you see the real pattern. In November of 1989, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a close ally of the German chancellor was assassinated. Alfred Herrhausen, the chairman of Deutsche Bank, was killed by a roadside bomb so sophisticated that the case has never been solved to this day. Why him? He was building a plan to rebuild Poland's industry using a national reconstruction bank with directed long-term credit for factories and infrastructure. He was also calling for third world debt relief. None of that was in the globalist plan. And Herrhausen's policies were similar to the American system policies now being revived by this administration. 2 years later, in April of 1991, Detlev Rohrabacher was assassinated by the same left-wing terrorist group. He was a steel man trying to restructure East German factories and save them. After he was killed, the factories were asset stripped by financial parasites, and about 4 million jobs in East Germany disappeared. In both cases, the builder is removed, and the policy that follows comes right out of the imperial business model. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. Moro, Herrhausen, Rohrabacher, all committed to political and economic sovereignty for their nations. Rubio also mentions other left-wing terrorist formations, like Peru's Sendero Luminoso, which killed tens of thousands and explicitly targeted engineers and agronomists and Peru's infrastructure. Secretary Rubio drew the right conclusion.
It has always been driven by a hatred. Above all else, a hatred for civilization itself. It is a revolt of the worst against the best, a revolt of the weak and the cowardly against the strong and the good. It is perpetrated by those who cannot build, who cannot create, who cannot achieve great things.
He just didn't name the names of the greater men. I did. So step back and look at the two podiums together, the way your social media feeds never will. The empire has only ever had two levers to overturn the verdict of a free people: corrupt elections or kill the leaders who threaten their system, rig the ballot or remove the builder. And in a single day, this administration moved against both. At the first podium, the president dragged the election cover-up into the daylight and made the people who buried it show themselves. Mark Warner in words, the networks in darkness. At the second podium, the Secretary of State put the history of political assassinations on the world stage, and the Treasury Secretary dared the press to look at it. For centuries, the empire has used irregular warfare to maintain its power. The United States is now led by people who are finally fighting back on that battlefield.